In this video, we're heading deep into the remote stretches of the Appalachian Mountains to explore two stories that really stuck with me. The moment I received them, I knew they belonged on the channel. The first is about a roommate, someone who seemed normal at first, but was clearly hiding something much darker beneath the surface. The second follows a man who is trying to escape a dangerous situation, but runs into the woods, and ends up finding something he never expected. I hope you find these stories as gripping as I did when I first came across them. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened 4 years ago, right as I was finishing my master's degree. I'm a historian, and I've always been deeply fascinated by the intersection between fantasy, folklore, and reality. There's absolutely no place on Earth that captivates me more than the Appalachian Mountains. I think most of you already know why. But if you don't, well, let me just say this. It's one of the most enigmatic regions on the face of the Earth, and I consume every piece of content I can find about it. The university where I did my master's had a summer internship program that allowed students to spend a few months exploring the specific area they wanted to base their thesis on. So naturally, I didn't miss the chance to spend my summer up in the mountains. The school covered almost everything in terms of expenses, but the place they found for me to stay was too far from the area I really wanted to study, so I ended up trying to find something on my own for the summer. And contrary to what I initially thought, there were actually quite a few options available, but every single one of them was more expensive than I could afford. Time was running out, and I wasn't finding anything suitable, and since I was getting a little desperate, I did something I knew I probably shouldn't have done. I came across a random post on Reddit from a guy who was renting out one of the rooms in his house. I reached out directly, and the price was so good that I accepted without thinking twice, and without checking whether it was actually legit. The house was a bit more isolated than I'd expected, but honestly, that was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted the full experience of being somewhere truly remote. When the day finally came and I arrived, I was nervous. I hadn't seen a single photo and was basically putting my trust in a complete stranger. But when I got there and saw that the house was real and the guy actually existed, I was so relieved that I ignored the fact that he was incredibly strange. The way he spoke and moved his hands felt like he was performing, like he was trying a little too hard to come off as friendly. I told myself he was probably just an odd person who lived alone in the middle of nowhere, and that kind of thing can make people weird sometimes. But after a few days, I started to get genuinely freaked out. His name was Derek, but he insisted, almost aggressively, that I call him Danny. Sometimes he'd be overly friendly, almost uncomfortably so, and other times he acted like I didn't even exist. What was most bizarre were the rules. The house had 3 floors: a basement, the main floor with the kitchen, living room and bathroom, and then the upstairs bedrooms. Not that I had any interest in going into the basement, but the way he forbade it was strange. Even after I told him multiple times that I had no interest in going down there, he reminded me almost every single day. It was like he wanted me to get curious and go. Like he was planting the idea on purpose. His schedule was weird too. He'd leave the house multiple times after 11 p.m., and I'd hear him come back only around dawn. But he never took the car. He always walked. We were surrounded by nothing but forest, totally isolated, and there was nowhere to go out there. At least, nowhere I knew of. But he had never been aggressive. At least, not until the night he caught me in the kitchen at 3 a.m. I knew he was out. I'd heard him leave around 11:30. That night, I was struggling to fall asleep. So around 3 a.m., I got up to grab a glass of water. He caught me standing in the kitchen and completely lost it. He started accusing me of sneaking down into the basement, of trying to figure out what he was hiding down there. He said I didn't know how to respect his boundaries. I kept trying to explain that I'd just come down to get a drink of water, but it didn't matter. He was getting more and more unhinged, so I just went back to my room. It took me a while to fall asleep, but I eventually did. Then I woke up around 5:30 in the morning with a strange feeling. I rolled over in bed, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting at the foot of my bed just staring at me. I jumped up in a panic and asked him what the hell he was doing in my room. By then, he seemed much calmer and said he just wanted to apologize, that he knew I hadn't gone into the basement. That completely threw me. I told him he couldn't just come into my room like that, for any reason. He stared at me for a long while, like he didn't quite understand what I had just said. Then he got up and walked out. That reaction unsettled me more than anything else. I think I would have preferred if he'd stayed angry, because that weird, silent look he gave me was much harder to process. And then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. I always locked my door. I always did, especially with a roommate like him. When I asked him later that morning how he got into my room, he looked caught off guard. Then he said the door had been open, that he knocked and I didn't answer, so he came in. I knew both of those were lies. I never left my door unlocked, and I'm a light sleeper. If he'd knocked, I would have woken up. Still, I let it go. I had another area I wanted to explore that day, and later, I planned to hit the library. I wasn't going to let him ruin my day. But as I started hiking through the forest, I began to get that feeling again. That same eerie sensation I'd had a couple of times before in that area. Like I was being watched. Like I wasn't alone out there. I study folklore, and my favorite thing about it is how it connects to reality, and how that reality can sometimes get twisted. But this feeling, it was intense, it was persistent, and it felt completely real. I stopped for a bit by a creek, barely 10 minutes into the walk, which meant I was still relatively close to the house. I seriously considered turning back early and just heading to the library. But that's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure off to my right, moving slowly in the opposite direction. Whoever it was, they were standing in a shadowed area, so visibility was low. And suddenly, I couldn't shake the thought that he had followed me. I didn't know this man at all, and his behavior was getting more and more disturbing. I still had no idea what he was hiding in that basement. And here I was, completely alone and isolated with him, out in the middle of nowhere. As I walked back toward the house, I kept telling myself I'd never put myself in that kind of situation again. But just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, that night, they did. I hadn't heard him leave, so I assumed he was either still in his room or maybe in the basement. I went downstairs to eat dinner, and at some point I heard his bedroom door open and close, followed by the sound of another door, probably the bathroom. When I headed back upstairs, I figured he was still in the bathroom, since I hadn't heard his door again. But when I walked past, the bathroom door was wide open, and the light was off. Without a second thought, I went to my room, locked the door from the inside like always, and put on some YouTube videos. I wanted to get to sleep early, but listening to someone talking always helped calm me down. I was almost asleep when I heard it. A muffled sneeze. It was so quiet, it was barely noticeable, but it was definitely real. Someone was in the room with me. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and as I reached for my car keys, I saw him. Crawling out from under the bed. That image is burned into my brain. Without thinking, I bolted out of the room, ran through the house, jumped in my car, and floored it out of there as fast as I could. Even as I drove, the image of him slithering out from under the bed haunted me. What the hell was he doing there? What was the point of all of this? A few days later, I got an email from him saying I owed him the last month's rent. I couldn't believe the audacity. So I replied and told him if he ever contacted me again, I'd go straight to the police. As you can probably imagine, I never heard from him again. I've lived my whole life here in West Virginia. Some say it's the scariest state in the country. Others say it's the most beautiful. There are days when I believe the first, and others when I believe the second. I know what happened to me about 2 weeks ago could have taken place anywhere, but the fact that it happened in a completely isolated spot, right in the middle of the Appalachians, makes it all the more terrifying. I moved into the house where I live now 3 years ago. I've always lived a pretty isolated life. My parents had a small farm a few miles away from here, and the nearest neighbor was still a good drive from the house. So, the isolation itself was never really a problem. The real problem was the forest. I always respected it, and I always knew there were things living in it that were hard to explain. That's why I followed those basic rules to the letter. Don't go out after dark. Don't respond to strange sounds. Don't break the silence unless you absolutely have to. I was always careful. On the day it all happened, the plan was to stay home in the evening. I was exhausted and really just needed to rest. But one of my best friends had a delay at work and asked if I could pick up his son from school. Since I was already going out, I figured I might as well take the opportunity to get some groceries too. I was running low on just about everything, and I'd been reheating the same meal for the past 2 days. From my house to the center of town, it's about 16 miles, so anytime I make the trip, I try to make it count. The plan was pretty simple. Pick up the kid around 5 p.m., make a quick stop at Walmart before it closed, and then head home. I got to the school at about 4:50 and waited for the kid to come out. I was killing time on my phone when I noticed a car parked at a distance. I remembered it because I'd seen it about 2 weeks earlier in a parking lot. It was a black Lada, something you almost never see around here. I've always liked the brand, but they're incredibly rare in this part of the country. I didn't think too much of it at the time, just noted it and went back to my phone. Around 5:05, the kid showed up, and we headed over to Walmart. One thing I never realized before is that when you're with someone else's kid, you become paranoid. I started noticing a man in a flannel shirt and a baseball cap. Yeah, I know, couldn't be more cliché. But what made me notice him wasn't how he looked. It was the fact that I kept seeing him in every single aisle we went down. It genuinely felt like he was following us, and it didn't seem like he was trying very hard to hide it either. I thought about talking to the security, but I didn't really have any proof, and I didn't want to cause a scene. So I decided to cut the shopping short and get out of there. I figured I could come back another day, alone. As we walked out into the parking lot, I spotted the guy again. He was already outside, standing near one of the cars. I considered confronting him. But again, I had nothing concrete, and the last thing I wanted was to escalate anything, especially with a kid beside me. So I got into the car and got out of there as fast as I could. That's when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man walking toward a vehicle, and realized it was the same Lada I'd seen before, both earlier that day and 2 weeks earlier. I decided I had to talk to my friend. I had to tell him that someone had been following his kid. I told him I'd go with him to the police if that's what he wanted. I could give a solid description of the guy, and Walmart surely had footage of everything. But it's not an easy thing to tell a parent, so I ended up staying at his house later than I'd planned. We talked about what I saw, about the man, about the car, and agreed to go to the police the next morning. The kid would stay home with his mom while we went to the station, so I left his place around 10:30 p.m. As I mentioned, I live 16 miles outside of town, on a dirt road that cuts straight through the forest. I always take it slow to avoid damaging the car. But that night, I was tired, and I just wanted to be home. So I pushed the speed a bit. It was already dark by then, and like I said before, I hate being out there after sundown, not even in my own yard. I never go outside after nightfall. The moment I pulled in, I made sure the car was locked and quickly made my way to the front door. The first thing I noticed when I walked in was the smell. Something foul that I couldn't quite place, but definitely unpleasant, like a mix of sweat and dampness. I got worried it might be coming from me, so I figured I'd shower before bed. As I made my way upstairs, I realized the light in my bedroom was on. That struck me as odd. I was pretty sure I'd turned it off. But it had still been daylight when I left, so I told myself I could have just forgotten. I started heading up the stairs, but halfway up I heard the floorboards creak inside my room. And in that instant, everything clicked. Someone was in the house, and that smell. It wasn't me. That light, I hadn't left it on. As quietly as I could, I backed down the stairs and headed for the kitchen. I needed something to defend myself with, and my gun was in the bedroom. That's when I saw the kitchen window had been smashed wide open. That's how they got in. Outside was pitch black. I couldn't see anything. But then, suddenly, a pair of headlights turned on, blinding me through the broken glass. Whoever was inside my house wasn't alone. When I saw the car, it all made sense. They weren't after the kid. They were after me. But how did they know where I lived? And how long had they been following me, planning that break-in at my house? Then I heard a voice from upstairs. A man's voice, calm but certain, saying I had nowhere to run. My brain was still trying to catch up when I realized he was right. There wasn't anywhere inside the house I could go that they couldn't reach if they really wanted to, and there were at least 2 men, maybe more. The house was surrounded by forest, and that's when I realized, no matter how much the forest scared me, it didn't compare to the fear of having dangerous people hunting me down. Their car was parked around the back, which is why I hadn't seen it when I pulled in. If I ran out the front door, maybe I'd have enough of a head start to make it into the woods before they caught up. I bolted through the front door and sprinted as fast as I could straight into the tree line. I knew that forest. I may not have ever been deep in it at night, but it was still my territory. I knew it well in daylight, and that counted for something. I heard one man shouting to the other, then the sound of the car revving and following in my direction. I didn't stop when I hit the edge of the forest. I kept running between the trees. Not far from where I was, there's a stream that leads into a small cave. While I ran, I called 911. The dispatcher told me the nearest unit would take at least 17 minutes to reach me, but they were on their way. They asked me to stay on the line, but by then I couldn't hear anything but the sounds of the forest around me. I could hear the men too, off in the distance, moving. But more than that, I began to hear a kind of murmuring. I don't know how to explain it, but I know it came from the forest itself. At first, the murmuring lingered close. So close I could almost feel it. But then, slowly, it began to drift away, pulling itself through the trees in the direction of the men. I can't explain how I knew, but I felt it. Felt it moving toward them. I heard them shouting, then a gunshot. And then silence. Absolute, unnatural silence. And the forest went still. The murmuring was gone. Even the night insects had gone quiet. I didn't come out of that small hole in the rocks until I heard the police sirens in the distance. And the walk back to the house was completely silent. I could hear the sirens approaching, and through the phone still clutched in my hand, I could hear the dispatcher calling my name. But I couldn't answer. I was as still and silent as the forest itself. I didn't make a sound. It took me several minutes after stepping out of the woods to even begin to explain to the police who I was and what had happened. The car was still there, but the men were gone. Since that night, they've searched the woods again and again, but found nothing. They just vanished. I didn't tell the police what I heard out there. They'd think I was crazy. And maybe I am. I have no explanation for what happened. And I don't usually believe in things I can't explain, no matter how much I respect the forest. But I know something happened. And I think that the forest protected me. As crazy as that may sound, it reminds me of something my great-uncle used to say all the time. The forest has ways of protecting its own.